long term with the development of Dubai, that these new areas are eventually going to be valuable.
90% of people die within like 100 miles of where they're born.
This is the highest recorded population ever in Dubai. That's a good question.
If I'm comparing the last 5 years to the next 5 years, 5 years from now, I think this is going to be big.
And that was my first substantial risk. It doesn't matter where you are. There's opportunities everywhere. Perfect time is now. You have to be willing to put in the work.
Hamza, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Nido.
Pleasure. As we always start, what does freedom mean to you?
That's a tough question to answer without really thinking through, the perspective on that. But I think I look at it from two perspectives. One is the mental side of it. So, where are you mentally, right? Is your mind always racing that you don't even have freedom over your thoughts? And I think a lot of people, get sort of compelled to constantly overthink things. And I think freedom to me is one where I have control over my mind and I have some level of peace. I think that's one aspect of it. I think the other aspect is freedom of choice, right, and flexibility. So, that can mean a lot of different things. But, when I think about flexibility, whether you're in the corporate world and you're able to schedule your day and have freedom to do that and flexibility, that's one aspect of it. I think another one is, freedom of sort of development and identifying areas that you're passionate about and, being able to go full throttle.
Yeah, that's the thing about freedom, right? Like it can have so many different meanings. And the problem actually I see with people is that their definition of freedom is someone else's definition of freedom, and that's why they struggle to actually achieve their own freedom. They think, for example, freedom is all about having money. It can be, but I know a lot of wealthy people that have all the money in the world, but they still don't have freedom because, as you said, they don't have freedom of the mind. They still have other struggles that they struggle with. I know people that have what it appears to be an amazing job. In fact, it's crazy. What's crazy is my entire life I wanted to be a soccer player, right? Like that was like my dream. That was like my passion. And then when I came to Dubai and as last few years, I got to know a few of them on a personal level. And it's crazy how so many of them, as much as they love the money, the fame, all the stuff that comes with it, the one thing that they constantly tell me is that they absolutely hate the lack of freedom that it provides, because you're always traveling, you're always practicing, you're always playing, you're always, for like 10 months, 10 and a half months out of the year, that's your life. And the crazy part was, I'm like, part of me now is like, okay, a lot of guys in the soccer world, you can come into it somehow, right?
Yeah.
Some capacity, not as a player,
yeah.
Even though I might still have
be past that.
I might have a move or two still, in the package, but it's just like, but the question I was like, do I want that? Do I want to be on the road? Do I want to constantly be doing things that I might not want to do? So yeah, that's a great way to put it. Now, one thing I want to talk about before we get into the nitty-gritty details and talk about legalities of starting a business in Dubai, we talk about opportunities that are here, is you grew up in Michigan?
I actually grew up, I'm from Ohio.
Ohio, yeah.
Born and raised in a sleepy city, Toledo, Ohio. A couple 100,000, probably 300,000 with the outskirts population. So really small, Midwest feel, which was not a nice place to grow up, I would say.
Yes.
Because you're able, when you're in those surroundings, you're able to forge really good relationships. But a lot of it's a place where people sort of are born and raised and stay there forever.
Yeah.
Because you get, I would say, very comfortable.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a nice sort of lifestyle, and so I grew up there. in a blended family. You know, my parents were divorced. In a large family. You know, 3 brothers. You know, 6 sisters. So
MashaAllah.
we were always. Let me tell you this. We naturally became good negotiators.
Yeah.
Right? Because you know you're dealing with a lot of different personalities, but it was a nice way to grow up. That also gave me flexibility because I got to live in a lot of different communities, build a lot of different friendships. You know, because of the blended family.
Yeah.
And living, basically spending summers in different cities. So I enjoyed that. I think it was a great place to grow up. I love the Midwest. You know, I think you know it's a really nice place to grow up in the sense of escaping from the city.
Yeah.
You know, the hustle and bustle that we know of now. You know, living in Dubai, it's a sort of more relaxed environment. But if you get too relaxed, you know, you kind of limit yourself. And so, you know, I realized probably when I got into undergrad that I probably didn't want to stay, you know, in the Midwest. I had bigger dreams. I wanted to see what the world was like. And so, you know, one way I was able to unlock that was, you know, during undergrad, you know, I took you know, an externship in Washington, D.C., you know, the capital of the U.S., where you have a substantial, maybe an overpopulation of lawyers, right? You know, I was doing an externship for the Federal Trade Commission, and that really opened up my eyes to the world. You know, I got a good feeling of a flavor of what's out there, and I knew, you know, I had bigger dreams. That gave me sort of an indication that I probably wanted to go down the legal field. But as many people know, you know, you go through sort of a process of elimination about what it is that you want to do with your life. And so at one point, you know, I wanted to be a dentist. I wanted to be a pilot. You know, I you know, earlier I thought I'd play basketball. And so, you know, you sort of have all these visions. But early on, you're exposed to people, you know, unexpectedly that might push you in a certain direction just because you had a conversation with them. And so, you know, I knew that I wasn't going to stay in a small city. I knew that I wanted more. And so, you know, after undergrad, I ended up, you know, going through the process, taking my LSAT, you know, wanted to go to law school. And my first round was not a success, you know. So the door was closed on that. I didn't get accepted to where I wanted to be. And that was frustrating. And so I thought, you know, after I graduated undergrad, let me take a year off and work. So I, you know, moved to Northern Virginia. I took a sales role at Verizon. And I knew I needed time to reflect, you know, because, you know, that's the thing about life. You consistently have resistance, right? And you have these barriers that come up. And some people can get through it, or some people wait behind that, you know, praying that something might change. But I realized at that point, you know, if you really want to change, you have to be, you know, flexible and adapting and pivoting. And so I think that was a pivot for me to really assess what I wanted to do. Yeah. So I spent a year there, you know, retook my LSAT, you know, got a lot of good advice from people around me, and then got accepted to law school. So.
And then you ended up in the Middle East, and then you ended up in Dubai. And the question I want to ask is, because obviously I'm in the same boat. Like, I grew up in the States, grew up in Boston. A lot different than Ohio, but but winter is pretty much the same, right?
Harsh winters.
Yeah, harsh winters. And actually, last night I was at an event and I met a girl who's doing big things here, and she's also from Ohio.
Okay.
And that's what the first thing we talked about is the harsh winters. But we ended up here somehow. So want to know what led to that transition.
Sure. I mean, it didn't happen right away, right? So, I finished undergrad. Like I told you, I had a flavor of what big city living might look like, and I thought first, let me go to law school and figure out what that experience is like, right? And I went to law school, and I graduated probably at one of the worst times, right? You had the mortgage crisis, the economy wasn't doing so well, there was a lack of jobs, and I just thought, I had spoken to a few people that had graduated before me, and that had taken a job in the Middle East, right? And then there was someone else that I went to law school with, whose brother was a partner in a law firm in the Middle East. So I started thinking, well, what does that look like? And I started to do some research, and what I was surprised with is the sophistication of the transactions that they were working on. And I thought, man, this might be a good shortcut to get some good experience, and probably get out of the U.S. for a change, and so I used my network, right, and I had conversations with the partners there, and it's so funny how it happened, right, and that's the interesting thing about life is you plan something and something else comes up unexpected, and it's just a matter of am I willing to take a risk, right? And that was my first, I would say, substantial risk, which was, it was even before I had finished law school, they had given me an offer, and they said, hey, we have this offer for you. You have to move to Kuwait, a country I had never been to before, and within the next 6 weeks, which was like, wow, there's a lot of decisions I have to make at this point. And, I thought about it, and I told myself, hey, I'll try it out for a year. What's the worst that could happen? And the irony there, the 1 year turned to 14, 15 years, and I've been out here ever since. But I would say it was a great gamble. It was a good risk to take, and I think it paved a path that I never expected.
So yeah, I mean, it's I think that's one of the biggest decisions you can make in your life is to move.
Yeah.
And it can also be one of the best decisions you're going to be making, because most people, I don't know what the statistic is, I think that it's like 90% of people die within like 100 miles of where they're born, right? And if you look at that, you say, well, this is why a lot of times people's lives never change. You're around the same environment, you're around the same people, you're around the same opportunities. Therefore, to get something new into your life is extremely difficult. But when you make a decision to say, all right, you know what, like, okay, I see some people that I know or have heard of, they've tried this region. I don't know what to expect, there's uncertainty. Let me give it a try. And that's what we did.
Yeah.
And my thing was like, well, I'm sure if we don't like it, there's also a return flight to where we came from. People think like if you move, that's it. Like, and I've seen people who moved and came back.
Yeah.
And they didn't like, and that's fine. At least you took the risk. At least you gave it a try. And I think there's something to that. But I don't understand, because we talk a lot about entrepreneurship. We talk a lot about freedom. And I think a lot of it comes down to taking that risk, to being someone that's okay with trying something and okay with failing and okay with something not working out. And even if that happens and you come back to where you started from, give yourself a high five. You tried it. You're much better than the person or, the people who just kept thinking about it time and time again. Now, one question I want to ask you is, obviously you've been in Dubai now for years, and you've set businesses up and you've helped other people set up their business. If somebody wanted to launch their business tomorrow, what is something that they absolutely must know?
Well, I think there's two elements to that. One is the business angle and what sort of due diligence they've done to see whether that business is feasible, right? Because there's extreme competition out here, right? And so you have to identify what is the value proposition that you can bring to the table first. And are you willing to take the long road to success, to be able to succeed, right? Because sometimes, what I tell people, and I always tell people this, and I've worked with you, in the past, and I always tell people the same thing is, are you sure this is what you want, right? Have you, given enough thought about whether this makes sense for you, depending on where you are in life, and do you have the financial sort of runway to be successful, right? Because a lot of people will look at this in a vacuum, like, I know I want to do this, I have a passion for this, I know that I'll be successful, but they're not looking at it holistically, right? So I would say, step one, are you sure this is what you want to do? And did you do enough sort of analysis as to whether the business itself, even before we step into the sort of legal intricacies, is it worth your time? And are you willing to sort of put the amount of not just time, but your resources, right, into this to make it a success? So that's step one. And then step two, it's, okay, how do you want to structure this business? And what type of business is it, right? Is it a service? Are you going to be trading? Because the way most businesses are set up here are based on objectives, which is like basically the type of business that you're carrying out. You can identify it based on something called objectives, which is the commercial activities that the business will do. And so, that will give you an indication on where the setup is, because you have so many options. And so, the first thing that you want to do is, yes, this makes sense for me. Next thing is, there's an objective list, like commercial activities that you can go through and figure out, this is the one I want. Because for each objective, there might be additional requirements associated with that, right? An additional license or expertise that you might need to even qualify to set up that business. So that's one. And if you are going to set up a business, there's different options. Mostly it's, an LLC, limited liability company, similar to what you see in the U.S. And then you see, do you want it to be onshore or offshore? Recently, they made it available where you can own the business outright without any sort of foreign ownership restrictions.
This was a big limitation in the past, right?
Exactly.
Which now made a big.
Which is that you needed to have a local partner associated with your business. They've done away with that, right? And that was, I wouldn't say just limited to the UAE. That's throughout the GCC, which is, 51% is held by a local partner. That's a local national.
Now, question on that before you continue is, let's say I've created an establishment 10 years ago where I was in an agreement with a local partner. Can I change that now? Can I amend that, or is it only only for new businesses that can happen?
I would say it's for new businesses. That's a very complex, situation to answer outright.
Yeah.
It all depends, right? It depends on what you agreed to and whether you have, a shareholders agreement in place. What is your memorandum of association or articles of association of the business state, right? But I am seeing that now. I'm hearing about it in the market where people are trying to sort of unwind that relationship. But there's a lot of, say, risk associated with that if you're not having an honest conversation about, where you want to take the business and how the business is owned and who's entitled to what. And, because a lot of these businesses, if you think about it, it's at the end of the day, who controls the clients and who controls that relationship, right? And so if it was historically a nominee situation, which is basically you had a silent partner that wasn't involved in the business, then it's usually easier to unwind. It's usually easier to come to the table and have a frank conversation about, probably liquidating the business or buying out the partner. And so I would say it really just depends on the circumstances.
Now, I'm sure you've seen over the years, there are a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of businesses that are coming to Dubai. Is this one of the reasons, or there are other reasons behind this?
Well, I think people are coming to Dubai for a number of reasons, right? I think one, if you look at historically what's happened, Dubai has positioned itself in a really good, I would say, manner. And I think some of that has to do with what took place during COVID, right? And the expo that took place. And I would say there's a transition that's happening. And I think we feel it too, right? Being able to live here the last, 7 to 8 years, it was an international city, but it felt like a small city, right? There wasn't as much traffic. I don't think people knew it to the same degree on a world stage as people know now. And so there's a number of factors that contributed to that. And I would say the first thing was, in the short term, was COVID. I think they did an amazing job of addressing it, right? But also ensuring that people could still do business, right? Where other parts of the world were completely closed off. And so people who wanted to be able to still conduct business, to be able to meet, and I'd say a big segment of that was startups, right? So you started seeing people kind of shift at that point in time to say, you know what, I need to make sure that I could still carry out my business. Let's go set up in Dubai, right? Where the rest of the world was still closed off. So I think that was one element, right? I think the other element has to do with lifestyle, ease of business setup, removing a lot of barriers, and at the end of the day, being the center of the world, right? You could set up your business easily here, and then you don't have the same sort of tax exposure as other jurisdictions and countries. I know that they recently implemented a corporate tax, but if you compare it to other countries in, whether it be North America or Europe, you're still saving a significant amount of money. And so I would break it down into sort of, 3 elements, which is ease of setting up business, tax exposure, limited tax exposure, and then I would say lifestyle and safety.
Yeah.
It's a nice place to live.
Yeah.
It's a convenient place to live, and it's a safe place to live.
Yeah. One thing I always say, and it's something I learned a long time ago, is that those who say more do less, right?
Yeah.
And growing up in the States, whether it's from a local level to a state level to government level, all you hear is those in power just talking about what they're going to do, promising what they're going to fulfill. As you and I know, it never happens. One thing I realized about Dubai and living here is I don't think in the 8 years that I've been here, I've ever heard, whether it's a sheikh or someone who worked for the government, on what they're going to do. But you just see it done, right? Like if there is a problem, if there is an issue, if there is something that needs to be fixed, somehow it gets done. Like, I remember next to my house, there's this road like a while back that, just transitioned into, I just felt like there was something off, like it wasn't 100% safe. And I'm like, okay, I hope, this gets resolved. I don't know, in America, you might go somewhere and you leave a note, or I don't know if that works here. But like a month later, all I see is people start to work on that road because I'm sure that other people have realized. So that's one thing that I really like about living in Dubai, because people are working to fix issues and make life easier for those of us that live here. But now, as you mentioned, fortunately and unfortunately, a lot of people are realizing
It's not a secret anymore.
It's not a secret anymore, right? So do you think that now Dubai becoming a global city and becoming more competitive, and having a lot of entrepreneurs and millionaires and successful people and just normal everyday people coming from all over the globe, is that going to create more opportunities, or is that going to limit the resources that we have here?
Well, I think listen, that always depends on the perspective you take, and But I think it creates opportunities for sure because, but in different segments, right? I think, the more you could see over the last year, this is the highest recorded population ever in Dubai. I think it was like 3.8 million and a little over that. But yes, it creates opportunities because you're setting up new businesses, which means you need to support services, you need to support individuals. People are looking for real estate, they want to resettle their families. And so it contributes to the economy, right? But there is a cautionary note associated with that.
Yeah.
Because, you can even see with the migration of high net worth individuals and multimillionaires, the UAE was number one in 2024, right? So I think it was, the stat was 6,500, multimillionaire or millionaire status immigrating to the UAE. So I think that's good, but the caveat there is there's a number of individuals that are moving here that don't have a local business, right? And so a lot of the business and wealth that they're generating is outside the UAE, but they are contributing to the economy indirectly by just living here. Now, the cautionary element there is, and I think this has been discussed on several platforms, is sort of the middle class that are kind of getting squeezed, because of the jump in real estate, the jump in costs and expenses, the schooling. Now there's, a long waiting list of people trying to get into schools. And so I think it depends on the perspective you take. I see opportunity there. I still see that there will be opportunity going into, 2025, the tail end in 2026. But I think to some degree, it also depends on the sector that you're working in.
Yeah. Let's say that, I had $100,000 and I wanted to invest it something in Dubai. What would you advise?
Well, I think that's a good question. So I think it's the perspective on what your risk appetite is and what your long-term sort of consideration. I think the bulk of, if you look at from a GDP perspective and an investment perspective, the sort of foundational basis of investments here in the UAE is real estate, right? And so I think, and sort of that's the investment approach that I've taken, over the last 20 years. I love to invest in real estate. I think it's brought me sort of success personally. But I think that's an avenue that I would probably consider if, having $100,000 as looking at maybe, different investment opportunities, whether it be resale, secondary, which is something that's already been built, that's in the market, whether you want to use it personally or as an investment. And then, your other option is, looking at off-plan, which is basically a situation where it hasn't been built, right? They have all these plans associated with whatever development it is, and there's a payment scheme associated with it. And that's a sort of a long-term approach where you might be able to, build equity and investment in two ways, which is one, capital appreciation, which is, you're making payments over whatever the term of, whatever the payment term is, and then at handover, it's valued at a higher price than whatever you purchased it at. Now, the challenge there is, it's opportunity costs that you lose because you're waiting for the handover over a 3-year period, but you get capital appreciation potentially with that. So I would say, it just depends on the individual, but you could break it down into sort of 3 buckets, which is, I want to buy something now, that I can live in and build equity. I want to potentially buy something off plan where it can build capital appreciation. Or number 3, I want to buy something and I want to be able to rent it out and get an ROI on that rental. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can sort of build capital and build investment appreciation, but it just depends on your circumstances. But for me personally, I think investment in real estate has always been a successful avenue for me.
Yeah, yeah. Now, anytime you're investing in something, right, it's good to obviously look at the history of what that asset has grown. Like, for example, if we look at the real estate market over the last 5 years, I mean, would you say like 100% growth, maybe more in some areas? Now, if I'm an investor, I can look back and say, well, did I miss this boat? Yeah, because if I'm comparing the last 5 years to the next 5 years, like there's gotta be like massive growth for me to achieve the same results. So do you see things still growing, or do you think there will be some sort of an adjustment in the marketplace?
That's a good question. I think it depends on the investment that you're taking. I would say for apartments, potentially, I could see that the value of it reduces because you're getting a lot of handovers in 2025, right? Now, that could be addressed if we continue to see an uptick in population growth in Dubai or the UAE in general, right? Because then you have a supply, but then you have a demand, right? And the challenge becomes when you have oversupply. Obviously, anytime you have oversupply, it's going to impact the pricing of those units, whether from a purchase perspective or from a rental perspective if you're looking for a rental ROI. So that's one. Having said that, for villas, there still is not enough sort of supply of villas in Dubai. And so I still personally believe that you can build capital appreciation depending on the area and depending on what your purchase price is. I mean, it's just like any other investment, right? The most important part of it is what did you buy it at, right? Versus, what the current market price is. And there's tools where you can check that, like, DXB Interact, where, you could check the last transactions over, the last year, 2-3 years to give you an indication on, hey, is this a good deal, right? And I think that's a challenge with a lot of investors is you got to go into this with your eyes wide open, right? It goes back to my first point on some of the questions that you asked. Do your due diligence, right? Don't assume whatever agent that you're working with is going to give you sort of the full picture on what that investment entails and whether it makes sense for you personally, right?
Yeah. Now, obviously, a big indicator of investing in a good property is the location.
Correct.
And everybody loves Dubai, and everybody wants to be very close to the center. But now there are other areas that are also new and upcoming, whether it's Sharjah or obviously Ras Al Khaimah with the things that are happening there. Do you see opportunities in those areas as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are opportunities. And I guess to give a perspective on this, maybe to take it back a bit so that people have context. So, I work as a lawyer, but I would say over the last year, whether intentionally or unintentionally, I've been thrown into the real estate market. And I think some of that has to do with me seeing as someone that's lived here 8 years, wow, there's a dramatic uptick in real estate prices, rental the lease has increased substantially, right? And so, when I came in, I got a good price on, my rental, but then, with the prices increasing, I had to do an assessment. Does this make sense for me if I'm having to pay double what I paid last year, or even triple from 4 or 5 years ago? No, it didn't make sense, and that's what led me to start to think about purchasing a property. And then I went through this whole process with my landlord, and rental dispute center and litigation between him selling it, and I mean, a whole host of things happened. But I think that opened up my eyes where I was like, wow, I need to educate myself on the real estate market. And I went, there were so many things happened over the course of the year, and that sort of pushed me into it. And then I ended up finding a property independently in the same neighborhood that I had leased my property. But it was like a dynamic situation with the owner, right? And so, my background as a lawyer helped me in that instance. But then I decided, like, you know what, I'm just going to get my real estate license because I was frustrated with the lack of information in the market and sort of dealing with not every real estate agent, because there's a lot of knowledgeable real estate agents that weren't really looking at analyzing whether something made sense financially based on sort of my requirements and not giving me hard data, right? And so when that happened, I said, I'm gonna get my real estate license. I'm gonna buy this property myself, and I'm gonna take a deeper look into where there's value and how to unlock it, right? And so when I started that journey, I bought a villa, and I've spent the last 280 days renovating it, which is a whole sort of separate experience in of itself. But then I started to document it because I wanted to give people a first person perspective on some of the things that you need to consider if you're going to go through that process, right? And I was frustrated with the lack of information, right? Whether it be, how do you appoint a contractor? What's the steps of appointing a designer? How do you get approvals for the renovation process? And so, once I went through that process, I realized, hey, I think there's a lot of other people that would find this information valuable, right? And so I started to document it. And so going back to your question, that gave me an understanding of what the market looks like and some indication on where you can unlock value, right? So to answer your question, yes, if you're taking a long-term view and horizon, understanding that, the market has increased substantially over the last 4 or 5 years, and being able to, purchase now and see that there might be a dip in the short term, but long term with the development of Dubai, that these new areas are eventually going to be valuable, and that whatever property that you buy, there will be a capital appreciation, but you got to be patient.
Yeah, yeah. As you know, in 2024, took a few big hits when it comes to investments.
Yeah.
But I always look at the lessons in life, right? Like, good things happen, bad things happen, but there are always lessons there. And the biggest lesson I learned is to go to the party that no one's at yet. So what I mean by that is, today you say Bitcoin, everybody's like, yeah, I wish I bought it, when nobody was talking about it. Imagine that, right? Real estate is the same thing. Like 5-6 years ago, market was decent, not a lot of buzz, great opportunities, great properties available, but nobody was talking about it. I mean, being one of them, like Dubai Hills, right? Like we saw that built right in front of our eyes. And before COVID, during COVID, I mean, it was literally out there for the taking. But you look at it today, that's where the party is, and the prices are crazy. So with that in mind, I'm like, all right, where is the next party going to be at 5 years from now, right? And that's like, a thinking framework that I'm trying to develop, not just in investment in real estate, but in anything. You look in the future, you say, okay, 5 years from now, I think this is going to be big. Let me start now. And obviously, when you think like that, obviously there's a bigger risk because it might not happen.
Correct.
But if it happens, you hit the jackpot. So for me, looking at places that, like no one's talking about right now, whether it's like in Sharjah or whether it's like, in Ajman or even like in Dubai, but a bit more on the outskirts. Like, I'm looking at that as the next big opportunities because everybody's now coming to Dubai, but eventually there's going to be a point where either people are going to be outpriced or there's just not going to be anything available. So is there any specific locations, any specific projects, any specific areas that you feel that in the next few years might be that jackpot that we're talking about?
Sure. So, Dubai South, where the new airport is going to be, people talk about that.
It already went like
Yeah, and it already increased
so
substantially.
yeah.
So I think, that's an interesting question. If you look at Dubai, they're redrawing the map, right? So, what was the center of Dubai is now changing, substantially because as a city, it's expanding, right? And so there are a number of projects that I think are really fascinating in the sense of, what they're offering from an amenities perspective. But before I answer that, a couple of things to consider, right? Because every investment you look at is like low, medium, high risk, right? Irrespective of what it is. And I think that's the same thing when it comes to real estate, right? And so what I will tell you is there's some aspects of real estate when you purchase it, it insulates you from exposure to a certain degree. And what is that? Okay, centrally located, like for instance, the Palm. There's no more real estate available on the Palm, right? And so it has a unique value proposition, and it makes it scarce, right? And so I always think that that's always going to be in demand to a certain degree, right? Same thing with JBR, Marina. That's one aspect. Number two is, does it have water view, right? That insulates you. Anything that's sort of has sea view, that's always going to be hot. That's always going to be, you're always going to have the opportunity to readily sell that unit without as much exposure, right? So before I answer your question, I just want to give you a baseline that if you are looking at different investments, you need to look at it from low, medium risk. And I think, that sort of qualifier addresses your ability to sell things relatively quickly, right? But there are other areas like, for instance, Majid Al Futtaim, which has at Gaff Woods near, what is that? It's near that amusement park. I don't remember the name of it. But that's going to be an interesting area because it's going to be completely forested.
Yeah.
Right? So completely green. Yeah. Similar to what, Aralda did in Masar and Sharjah.
We just came back with actually a week, 2 weeks ago, just to check it out. I'm like, this is
amazing.
Amazing.
70,000 trees that they planted there, and a lot of them are mature trees.
Right.
And so that's a unique value proposition that makes it, it's sort of a development that stands out from so many other developments.
Yeah.
And so that's, another thing that you should consider. I think another element too is the developer and the quality of finishing, right? Because I would say that's another consideration, because with the market being so hot, a lot of smaller developers are coming in, and unfortunately, their level of finishing, the level of quality is not the same.
Yeah.
Right? And so what I would say is not all developers and developments are created equally. And so you need to do some sort of due diligence. I would say you need to stick with known developers that have good finishing and have a unique offering. What is the unique offering? Right? Yeah. Because that insulates you from any exposure in a worst case scenario. Because that's how I look at investments to a certain degree.
Yeah.
Is if I buy this property, what is the worst case scenario if I needed to sell it?
Yeah.
Right? And if there is a dip, how do I reduce my exposure? And the only way you reduce your exposure is if it's a unique offering.
Yeah.
Right? And if you are going to buy a property, make sure in whatever building, whatever location, it has the best offering. Right?
Okay. Now let's say that I did find my dream investment property or home, paying terms, loans. From that perspective, is it easier to do business here versus, say, the States or other countries?
Yes and no. If you're a cash buyer, always easier.
Of course.
And it unlocks different opportunities, including a golden visa, depending on the value of the home or the property, which is great for long term. So that's one element. The other element too is, from your rental proceeds, the profits you get to keep. because it's in your personal capacity. So people, outside the region who might want to sort of invest here, that's another sort of value add compared to other countries or jurisdictions. So that's one element. The other element is, if it's a couple things to consider, right? So if you're going to get a loan and you want to buy for yourself, you need to get pre-approved, and there's a whole host of documents that they're going to need to check. But it's no different than what you would see in the U.S., right? They want to see your W-2s. Here they want to see a salary letter. They want to see your bank statements. They want to just make sure that you can afford, the payments on whatever loan that you get from the bank. It's a long process, and I would say, if you're going to go through that process, you want to make sure that you get an idea of what your interest rate is and what's the most competitive. And I think, one consideration if you are going to go down that route is just work with a mortgage broker so they're not tied to a single bank, and you can get a wide lens view of the best option for you from an interest rate perspective, or if you're doing Islamic financing. And so I think the good thing here is you could take a loan if you have at least 20%, 20% of the value of the property, you're paying in cash, right? You got to pay at least 20%, and you can mortgage up to 80%. Now, historically, what you used to be able to do is also, the bank would cover 80% of the broker fees and your DLD fees. That's no longer the case. So, the central bank took the view that they're no longer going to offer that, which means now people who are looking to invest and want to get a loan have to pay, more, have to have a greater amount of savings to be able to afford, a property.
Yeah.
Right? Because that option for covering the broker and DLD fees is no longer there. So still a good sort of market to invest in, and I would say very competitive when it comes to interest rates compared to other sort of regions. I mean, I would say it's hovering around 4%, depending on the bank and the loan term. But, the difference between here and sort of other countries is, the loan can't, the loan interest rate can't be fixed for more than 5 years.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's some variable, that after the 5-year term would be adjusted versus what you could see in the U.S. or other jurisdictions where, you're taking a 25-year mortgage with a fixed interest rate. Right. So my point is you need to be aware of that. I think the other element though too, which is helpful for foreign investors, is even if you don't live here, a local bank will finance you up to sometimes 40 to 50%. A lot of people don't realize that. And that's another sort of avenue where you could, leverage to a certain degree, buy an investment property, and start building sort of equity in it without having to use a bank in your home country.
But can you use a bank in my home country? So, for example, let's say that I want to buy a property here, but I want to go through a third-party bank outside, perhaps maybe because I have a longer fixed terms.
I don't know, what that looks like. I would probably say very unlikely, because they're not aware of of what the procedures are locally, and I don't even think you could put a mortgage on the title deed at that point if it's a foreign bank, or how that would be set up. I think what most people would do is probably take a personal loan.
Yeah,
but that doesn't make sense,
right?
Because you're paying a substantial amount,
right?
From an interest rate perspective than you would with a mortgage.
Of course,
right?
Of course.
So I would say that's limited.
Yeah.
To a certain degree.
Now you mentioned that you don't have to live here for you to be an investor, right? Is there advantages to that versus those of us who are actually living in Dubai? We understand the market. We're here versus someone in UK, US, and is this something that is currently happening in the marketplace?
Yes, I think Absolutely. And one of the indicators is what your ROI on investment is based on on your lease. And you could comfortably get, 6.5%, which I would say, comparative to other markets is pretty high. And if you've bought, some of these properties off plan, the ROI can be between 8 and 10%, which is substantial. I mean, that's a very good ROI. And so I would say you could look at it from that lens. If you're a foreign investor that's looking to invest in Dubai, why would you invest here? Is because, I would say, historically speaking, your ROI compared to other countries is higher, right? So you're getting a better return on your investment.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier apartments, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so apartments, obviously, it's easiest route, or simplest route, should I say, here in terms of getting an investment property. And I mean, I'm seeing like a new building
Every
going up
day,
every
yeah.
day. Literally,
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't remember this, I don't remember that, and it keeps going up and up. Obviously, it shows that there is demand at this stage. But as you mentioned earlier, like once all these things are up and ready and there's handover, could there be like massive crash if somehow, whether people go back to their countries or whatever? I mean, there's just like a black swan event
Sure.
that can happen. I mean, what's the risk behind that?
Well, I don't think anybody knows.
Yeah.
Right. And if no one's going to definitively say that, I think that the market's going to crash. You can't time that, right? Which is why I would always tell people, if you're going to invest in something, take a long-term approach.
Yeah.
Right? Don't just take, 1 or 2 years. Take a long-term approach. Having said that, I would say, I think the federal government and the rulers of the country have taken sort of strategic initiatives to reduce that sort of event from happening. And I think one measure of, with the central bank, removing your ability to finance your DLD and your broker fees means that only sort of people who have a sort of financially strong position are going to invest.
Yeah.
Which always helps, right? Because that reduces over leverage. So that's one. And I think the other thing too, that we kind of alluded to earlier in our conversation is Dubai isn't what it used to be.
Yeah.
Right? It's really an international city that's attracting a lot of talented people, a lot of investment, a lot of companies that want to establish their presence here. And so I think that reduces to some degree the exposure. But I go back to my first point. Whenever you're going to invest, try to minimize your risk as much as possible. And the only way I think you can do that is by, picking a developer that's well known. Helps reduce that substantially, because someone's always going to want to buy in that development versus other developments where not so well known, maybe the finishing isn't good. So that's one element. The other element is, what is the value here? Is it a unique, value proposition or opportunity that stands out from the rest of the pack?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because that shields you to a certain degree in a worst case scenario.
Yeah.
Right? Where you'll always either be able to sell with a minimal loss, or you always be able to rent that out. And so I can't answer that for you. I think, that's a point of any investment, is to try to structure it in the best way possible so that you minimize your exposure, right?
Yeah.
I would say take those steps instead of trying to time the market.
Yeah.
Because no one's going to be able to time the market. It's either you decide this is what you want to get into from an investment perspective, and then once you go through that process, talk to someone who's knowledgeable and sort of steering you in the right sort of direction or path.
Is Dubai success? I mean, now obviously everybody knows Dubai. That's this international city. People are flocking to it. But obviously now Saudi's up and coming. Qatar's always been there. Do you think that Dubai's success is something that's just going to trickle out to all these other GCC countries and make the entire region substantially, I guess, an interesting place to invest in, to come and live? Or do you think this is just going to be solely available to Dubai?
No, I don't think that. I think you always should follow the money.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
So, I think Saudi Arabia knows what they're doing when it comes to how to position themselves for the future. I mean, there's been think about it. From the first time, I went to Saudi probably about 10 years ago to, going to Saudi Arabia probably a few months back, it's unrecognizable.
Yeah.
With the shift of investment, of policies, and sort of repositioning themselves away from, completely, completely tied to oil and, revenues from oil to trying to diversify, right? And so they're spending a significant amount of money, probably over, at the end of the day, probably over $1 trillion in a lot of these projects. And so I think they're repositioning themselves, and it's exciting.
Yeah.
And I think it creates a healthy competition where, and competition is always good for everybody, which is the end consumer, right? Because at the end of the day, they're developing cities, massive cities, whether it be NEOM or Red Sea Project, that I think, time will tell what that looks like. But I think the fact that they're repositioning themselves away from just oil revenue is going to create a lot of opportunity in the future, right? It's just a matter, it goes back to, are you an early adopter, and are you willing to sort of put in risk into a new market?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And taking a long-term horizon on that investment, right? Because there are going to be sort of property investments that look amazing, but sort of time will tell how that develops.
Yeah. I've heard many leaders from this region refer to this region as the new Europe, right? And you can see that. I mean, you can see the opportunities coming. You can see a lot of Europeans, whether you're in Dubai, whether you're in Saudi, whether you're in Qatar. Never been to Bahrain, Oman. I might have seen one or two. And on the retrospect, I mean, you go to Europe, like literally, like where are you? Like what's happening there, from lack of opportunities in many of the countries there, horrible weather all the time, violence, and so many other things and that's happening there. Where do you see the opportunities in this region in general, and in the next, say, like coming 5 years, right? Like what sectors do you think are going to develop? Do you see more people coming in, not just like, obviously just in Dubai, we already talked about that, but overall, like what is the vision, and what are some of the things that you've seen being behind the scenes, working with some big companies here, that is happening in this region?
Well, I think one is the startup economy. Mm-hmm. You could see a lot of startups being set up here that have been successful, will continue to be successful, and even at a seed stage, right? And so that's a sort of a natural progression in any developing, economy. So I see that as a future. I think that's one aspect. Also from a content creation perspective, you saw, at the 1 Billion Summit, there's a lot of investment going into development of content creators and establishing the UAE in the region as a hub for that. And so I think that's going to be the baseline, right, which is startups. But I also see, you could see investment maybe from multinationals coming into setting up regional headquarters for a number of reasons. So that's also really important. I think the other element that would be nice is to see continued uptick from a manufacturing perspective, right? That would be, very interesting. But I think at the end of the day, it just depends on the sector, right? Renewables is another really, important sector that's driving a lot of investment. But from my perspective, that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing a lot of startups, which requires very unique skill sets,
Yeah.
right? Which is bringing in probably a lot of individuals from all over the world that see opportunity and want to be involved in the growth of this region, right?
Yeah.
But again, I just want to highlight there's opportunity everywhere you go.
Yeah.
Right? It goes back to probably the most important thing is, and I just want to just kind of highlight this, is whether you're able to see the opportunity.
Yeah.
Because that's a skill set in of itself.
Yeah.
Because some people will be put in a situation where there's so many sort of avenues to create wealth. There's so many avenues to develop yourself, but they just don't see it, right? And I think that's a skill set in of itself. And I think one personal example is, when I bought my villa, where it's located, there was only 36 villas like facing the park. I said, I thought to myself, wow, worst case scenario, I'm always going to have someone that's going to want this villa because it sits on a large plot, and there's so many benefits associated with it, but it's old for Dubai purposes, right? Like 10 years here is old, 10 or 12 years, and I think a lot of that has to do with the sun exposure. And so at the end of the day, it doesn't matter where you are. There's opportunities everywhere. It's just, are you willing to see that? And are you willing to take action to take that opportunity and run with it?
Yeah.
Right? And so with that, I think the way that this region is being structured, there's a lot of inherent opportunities. There's a lot of ways for personal development. It's just a matter of, is that individual being able to see that? And are they willing to take action to pursue those opportunities or not?
Yeah.
So, because a lot of people want to compare, Europe to the Middle East. They're completely different, right? And there's still, even in London, there's always opportunities when it comes to real estate, but the entry point is super high, right? And so but that's a conservative investment, right? Someone's always going to want a property in London, but I think that creates value for people that maybe don't have as much money to invest, where they can enter, the UAE, taking a long-term view and horizon to develop some wealth.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just at London recently, and one thing I realized, not just in London, I obviously being from Boston, the same thing. You look at this real estate market and you say, okay, some things might be expensive, but what you get in terms of the size, in terms of the location, compare to what for the same amount, what that would get you in like a city like New York, city like Boston, city like London, it's almost like incomparable. Like for what you can get, maybe like a condo or 1 or 2 bedroom apartment, you can pay, you can invest that same amount and get a nice villa here, right? Like I look at the rent market, for example, like in Boston. I have some family members, they're literally paying for a 2 bedroom apartment what I'm paying for my villa here.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
So I think that people forget that it's not just about how much you pay, it's what you're paying for. The other thing is, and we forget this, is that Dubai is like 50 years old, right? 56 or 55. So it's a very young country. And when we compare it to Europe and when we compare it to the States, first of all, it's actually not even fair. And second of all is that you have to be impressed at how fast they move, how quickly things happen here. And that's something that really, as an investor or someone that lives there, you have to put that into account, because that you've got a team. And if you look at your government as part of like your, the when you're investing in anything, like you're literally invested in the government as well, because you have to trust that they're going to do what's in the best interest of the country, so that opportunities continue to come. People still come, want to flock to this region, and job opportunities there. The economy is flourishing, right? So, because like you said, everywhere there's an opportunity. You can look at whether it's in Africa or whether it's in U.S. or whether it's in Europe, but you want to make sure that the government that is behind you is there to support you. And that's one thing that I realized in this country, is that even though you might wake up one day and be like, man, this is high, this is crazy, this price is going up. But then you have to ask, well, the reason this is happening and the reason success is being generated quickly is because you have a really good government behind you. So therefore, even if I invest today at a what might be like a higher price in market perspective, you're like, if you've got the same team working behind you in 5 years, why shouldn't this investment reap its rewards for you as well, right?
Exactly. I think you're right. I think, the major perspective on that is removing barriers and red tape, which I would say, the authorities here do brilliantly. And so, that's very important. But again, I think it goes back to supply and demand and where you see yourself personally, whether it be you living here, in your personal capacity or as an investor, and just taking a long-term view. But I think it would just continue, and you could see historically, it's always redefined itself. Whether it be, the federal government, UAE, or Dubai as a city, they're always reinventing themselves. They're looking at opportunities and always looking at the perspective of attracting foreign investment, but also making it a really nice place to live.
Yeah.
And so I see that continuing, in the short and long term.
Hamza, that brings us to the last question
Yeah.
of the day, which is, for somebody watching this episode and they want to achieve their own freedom, what advice would you give them to help them get to their goal?
Sure. There's never a perfect time, right? The perfect time is now. And if you're really looking to, achieve your goal and looking for financial independence and freedom, you have to be willing to put in the work, number one. Which means, you have to sacrifice some of your time and sit down and talk to experts, do your due diligence, figure out, what that means for you, and take not just a short-term but a long-term view on what that translates into. And I think, one element is to be willing to do that now and not to wait, right? Because I think that's the biggest issue, is you could be inundated with so many options that you resign yourself to not making a decision, right? And so I would advise people to be willing to take the risk to a certain degree, depending on where, what your comfort is from a low, medium risk perspective, and just, take action to, carry out your investments, because time moves quickly.
Yeah.
And hopefully over a certain period of time, you'll be rewarded for that risk.
Get started, take action, and enjoy the journey, right?
Exactly. That's the best part.
There you go. Awesome. Well, Hamza, it's been a pleasure having you. Thanks for sharing your insights when it comes to legalities of starting business here to investment opportunities. I think has been pretty insightful, and looking forward to catching up and seeing you do more real estate deals in the coming future. Thanks
My
so much.
pleasure. Good
All right.
speaking.